She spent most of her days quietly working in a small cafe tucked between two busy streets. It wasn't a fancy place, just a cozy spot where regulars came for coffee, pastries, and the comfort of familiarity. She knew many of the customers by face, and sometimes even by name, though she rarely spoke more than a few polite words. She liked it that way. Life had been quiet for her for a long time, and she found a kind of peace in simple routines. She made coffee, cleaned tables, refilled sugar jars, and when the cafe wasn't busy, she would sometimes sit by the old upright piano in the corner and let her fingers drift over the keys. No one ever really noticed her playing, and that suited her perfectly. The piano wasn't fancy. Its wood was scratched and faded, the keys a little chipped in places, and the sound wasn't as crisp as the piano she had seen in concert halls. But she loved it. To her, it was alive. When she touched the keys, she felt something awaken inside her that no words could describe. Music made her feel free, even if just for a little while. She didn't play for anyone but herself most of the time. It was a secret world, tucked away in the hum of the cafe, her small escape from the everyday struggles of life. She had grown up in a modest home, and piano lessons had never been easy. At first, she had borrowed books and practiced on an old keyboard someone had given her. She had been shy, quiet, and painfully aware that she didn't fit in with the other kids at school. Playing piano became her sanctuary. Over the years, she had practiced in stolen moments before school, after school, during evenings when everyone else was asleep. Her family never had the money for private lessons, but she had learned by watching videos, reading books, and most importantly, by listening. She learned how to feel the music, how to let it flow through her fingers without thinking too much. Even though she had grown into a talented pianist, she had never really performed in front of a crowd. Life had kept her busy with small jobs and responsibilities, and the thought of standing in front of people, letting them see her, terrified her. She preferred the quiet, the unnoticed moments where her music could bloom in secret. She liked the idea of her skill being hers alone. One afternoon, a group of customers arrived who didn't look like the usual regulars. They were well-dressed, laughing loudly, and the kind of people who drew attention without even trying. One of them, a man with a polished suit and confident air, noticed her standing behind the counter. He smiled in a way that felt both friendly and slightly teasing. "Do you play?" he asked casually, pointing at the piano. She froze for a moment. She wasn't used to being asked that, and especially not by strangers who seemed so confident and sure of themselves. She shook her head lightly, muttering that she only played a little. Quietly, the man laughed, not unkindly, but with a sparkle of mischief in his eyes. "Come on, just play something simple. I'm sure you can manage. It won't take long. I just want to hear a few notes." She hesitated. Her heart began to race. She had never played in front of strangers, especially not in a place so public. But there was something about his tone, half challenge, half jest, that made it hard to refuse. She glanced at the piano. Its keys gleamed faintly under the cafe lights, worn but inviting. She could feel the pull on it, the familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingers, and the thought of refusing suddenly felt wrong. I guess I can play a little," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. The man's smile widened. "That's all I'm asking. Just a simple tune. Nothing fancy." She nodded and walked slowly to the piano, each step heavy with nervous anticipation. The cafe seemed to grow quieter around her. Conversations faded, cups clinked softly on saucers, and even the sound of the espresso machine seemed distant. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, unsure, trembling slightly. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her chest. Then she began. The first notes were simple, exactly as he had requested. light and gentle, almost timid. She could feel every eye in the room on her, and the sensation was almost unbearable. But as she continued, something remarkable happened. The music began to flow in a way it never had before. Her fingers moved with a confidence that surprised even her. She wasn't just playing the simple tune anymore. She was adding subtle flourishes, delicate transitions, and soft expressions that lifted the music beyond its basic melody. At first, people didn't notice the change. They thought she was playing exactly what they had asked, for a quiet, simple tune. But gradually, the sound of the piano began to fill the room in a new way. The gentle notes carried emotion, the pauses and swells creating a story that no one could ignore. People stopped their conversations, cups paused mid-air, and the laughter of the newcomers quieted to a murmur. The man who had requested the tune leaned forward slightly, a curious smile on his face. He had expected something simple, perhaps even awkward, but what he was hearing now was something entirely different. The young woman didn't look at anyone. She didn't need to. Her world had shrunk to the keys beneath her fingers and the music rising from them. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Each note carried a part of her. Each chord whispered a story she had kept hidden. She could see, even without looking, that the room was changing. People were listening differently now. Their eyes softened, their faces relaxed, and a sense of awe began to settle over them. The man in the suit's smile faded into astonishment. He had expected something ordinary, and instead, he was watching something extraordinary unfold in front of him. He tried to mask his surprise, but it was impossible. The music was not just playing. It was speaking, telling a story, captivating everyone present. For the first time, the young woman felt a thrill that went beyond fear. She was no longer performing for strangers. She was sharing a piece of herself, and the room was responding. Time seemed to stretch. The simple tune had transformed into something beautiful, something alive. The patrons of the cafe shifted in their seats, leaning closer, holding their breath. Even the staff stopped their work, enchanted by the delicate magic of her playing. She didn't notice the applause that was slowly building in her mind. She only knew the music, only knew the connection it was creating between her and the people around her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, she ended. Her fingers lingered on the last note, letting it hang in the air for a moment before slowly lifting them from the keys. Silence followed, thick and heavy, like the room itself was taking a deep breath. People blinked, unsure how to respond at first. They had been transported somewhere else entirely, and now they were back, left in awe of the quiet power of what they had just heard. The man in the suit was the first to break the silence. His eyes were wide, and he laughed softly, a mix of disbelief and admiration. I didn't expect that," he said, almost to himself. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of truth. She had not only played a simple tune, she had made everyone in that room stop, listen, and feel something deeper than they had anticipated. She lowered her hands slowly, feeling a mixture of relief and exhilaration. Her heart was still racing, but now it was a different kind of excitement. She had stepped into a moment she never thought she would face, and she had emerged with something more than applause or recognition. She had shared her music, and in doing so, had reminded herself of the power she held within. For the first time in a long while, she realized that perhaps her music was meant to be heard, not just kept in the quiet corners of her life. She didn't know what the future held, and she didn't even know if she would ever play in front of a crowd again. But in that moment, she felt a spark of possibility, a quiet promise that this small act could change something for herself, and maybe even for everyone who had been listening. The cafe slowly returned to its usual hum, the espresso machine sputtering and the conversations resuming. But something had shifted. The patrons carried a newfound respect and perhaps a little wonder in their eyes. and she returned behind the counter, a quiet smile on her face, knowing that tonight had been the beginning of something she could not yet name, but would never forget. After that first performance, the cafe seemed different, almost alive in a way it had never been before. She went back to her duties quietly, refilling sugar jars, clearing plates, and making coffee, but every time she glanced at the piano in the corner, she felt a little pull in her chest. The keys seemed to be calling her, reminding her of the music that had just flowed from her fingers. It had been only a few minutes, but those few minutes had left a mark, not just on the patrons, but on her as well. She tried to brush off the feeling, telling herself it was just a small moment. It was over now, and things would go back to normal. But normal felt impossible after what had just happened. She found herself thinking about the music, about the way it had moved through her hands and out into the room. It was as if something inside her had awoken, something that had been quietly waiting for the right moment. The man in the suit, the one who had requested the tune, remained at a table near the piano, watching her carefully. He wasn't asking for anything more yet, just observing, almost studying her. He had expected a small, simple tune, perhaps something clumsy or hesitant, but what he had heard was astonishing. It was precise, expressive, and full of feeling. He could tell immediately that this young woman had more than just talent. There was depth in her music, a story behind every note, and he was determined to see where it could lead. A few of the other customers lingered longer than usual, finishing their drinks slowly, as if reluctant to leave the quiet magic behind. Some of them even whispered to each other, clearly impressed. They had not expected such a performance in a small, modest cafe. One woman, a regular who often came for her afternoon tea, whispered to her friend, "Did you hear that? That was beautiful. She plays like someone who has studied for years." She overheard the comment and felt a small blush rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to compliments like that. She wasn't used to anyone noticing her music at all, let alone praising it. She smiled softly, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness. It was strange, feeling seen for something she had always kept private. The man in the suit eventually stood and walked over to her while she was stacking cups behind the counter. His steps were measured, his expression serious but kind. "That was unexpected," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't know you could play like that." She shook her head modestly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's just something I do sometimes," she murmured, trying to downplay it. "I wasn't really. I mean, I don't usually play for anyone." He smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Well, you should. You have a gift. You shouldn't hide it. People need to hear this." Her heart fluttered at his words. She had never thought of herself as someone who could inspire others. She had always played for herself, for the quiet satisfaction of creating music in her own world. The idea that she might be able to share it with others, that people might truly listen and feel it, was both thrilling and frightening. "Maybe," she said softly, unsure how to respond. I don't know if I'm ready for that." He nodded, understanding. "You don't have to decide right now. But you should know. Talent like yours doesn't stay hidden for long. Eventually, someone will notice, whether you want them to or not." The rest of the day passed in a blur. She went about her work, trying to focus on the routine tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to the piano. Every time she saw it, her fingers itched to touch the keys, to feel the music again. She thought about the expressions on the faces of the patrons, the quiet awe that had settled over the cafe, and she couldn't help but smile. It had been a small moment, just a few minutes of playing, but it had left a mark that would not fade quickly. That evening, after the cafe had closed and the last customers had left, she found herself alone with the piano. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the lights and the occasional creak of the floorboards. She walked slowly to the piano and ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the familiar weight and texture. She sat down and let her hands rest lightly on the keys. Closing her eyes for a moment, she began to play again, starting with the same simple tune she had performed earlier. But as her fingers moved, the music grew richer, more expressive. She experimented with different chords, added small variations, and allowed herself to explore the depth of the melody. She lost track of time, lost in the sound, feeling the music flow through her like a living thing. It was in these quiet, private moments that she truly realized the power of her own talent. She could feel the emotion behind every note, the way it resonated not just in the room, but inside herself. She played for hours, letting the music carry her away, and for the first time, she began to imagine what it would be like to share this gift with the world. Out the next day at the cafe, things felt different. The patrons who had been there the day before approached her with smiles and quiet nods of recognition. Some of them lingered longer than usual, almost as if hoping she would play again. She noticed the way their eyes lit up when they saw her near the piano, and she felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and it made her heart race in a way that was both exciting and intimidating. During a slow moment in the afternoon, the man in the suit returned. He had brought a small notebook with him and approached her with a friendly smile. "I hope you don't mind," he said, "but I took some notes yesterday. I wanted to remember what you played. You have a way of expressing things. It's rare." She looked at him, surprised and a little embarrassed. "You wrote notes about what I played?" He nodded. "Yes. I wanted to see how you did it, the way you phrased the melody, the timing, the emotion. There's something unique about it, and I think it's worth exploring further." She felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, uncertainty, and a hint of fear. She had never thought of herself as unique or special. She had always believed that her music was just her own, a private part of her life. To hear someone else recognize it, to see someone take it seriously, was both flattering and intimidating. "Why? Why do you care so much?" she asked quietly. He smiled gently. "Because talent like yours doesn't come along often. Most people never get to hear something this pure, this real. I think the world deserves to hear it, and I want to help you figure out how to share it, if you're willing." She hesitated. The thought of performing beyond the cafe, of letting strangers see and hear her, was terrifying. She had spent so long in quiet, in the background, avoiding attention. But there was also a spark of curiosity inside her, a small voice whispering that maybe she could do more. Maybe she could step out of the shadows and let her music shine. I don't know," she said softly, unsure of how to respond. "I've never really performed for people like that before. I don't know if I'm ready." He nodded again, patiently. "You don't have to decide today. Just know that when you're ready, there's an opportunity waiting for you. And trust me, people will listen." Over the next few days, she found herself playing more often at the piano. Sometimes she played for herself in the quiet early mornings before the cafe opened, and sometimes she allowed herself to play for the customers who lingered longer than usual. Each time, she felt a growing sense of confidence, a quiet courage that had been missing for so long. The music became a bridge between her and the world, a way to express feelings she had never been able to put into words. She began to notice small changes in the cafe. Patrons would arrive earlier, hoping to catch her playing. People would linger longer, mesmerized by the sound of her fingers on the keys. Even the staff, who had grown used to her quiet presence, seemed to treat her differently, with a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. And then, one afternoon, a new group of customers arrived. They were different from the usual crowd, more formal, more serious. One of them glanced at the piano and smiled, clearly recognizing it as more than just a piece of furniture. The others watched her with curiosity, waiting to see what she would do. She felt a familiar flutter in her chest, a mixture of nerves and excitement. She walked to the piano, as she had done before, and let her fingers rest lightly on the keys. She began with a simple tune, just as she had the first time, but this time she allowed herself to explore it more deeply. She added small flourishes, subtle expressions, and gentle variations that made the music come alive. The new customers leaned in, clearly impressed. They were quiet at first, unsure what to expect, but as the music flowed, their expressions changed. Eyes widened, mouths parted slightly, and a hush settled over them. They could feel the emotion in her playing, the depth of feeling that went beyond mere technical skill. She didn't notice their reaction at first. She was lost in the music, in the way it carried her, and the room along with it. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful. She could feel the story she was telling, the emotions she was sharing, and she allowed herself to be completely present in that moment. By the time she finished, the room was silent again. The final note lingered in the air, and for a moment no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, applause began to build. It was quiet at first, almost tentative, but it grew steadily, until the room was filled with clapping and murmurs of admiration. She looked up, surprised and a little overwhelmed. The new customers were smiling, some leaning forward to speak to her, and the man in the suit was standing near. The days after her second performance were unlike anything she had ever experienced. People seemed to sense something special in the cafe now, something that had not been there before. Regular customers came in with quiet smiles, and new faces appeared as if drawn by whispers of the music they had heard. It was strange and exciting all at once, and she felt a nervous energy every time she approached the piano. She had grown more comfortable with the idea of playing in front of others, but it was still a challenge. Her hands sometimes shook before she began. Her heart would race, and doubts would creep into her mind. What if she made a mistake? What if someone didn't like what she played? But the moment she touched the keys, all those fears melted away. The music had a way of taking over, guiding her fingers, and allowing her to speak in a language that words could never reach. One busy afternoon, the cafe was filled with more customers than usual. Word had spread that she might be playing, and a quiet excitement hovered in the air. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the piano as they ordered coffee or settled into their seats. She felt the weight of their attention, but instead of making her nervous, it gave her a strange sense of purpose. She was ready. She walked to the piano and rested her hands on the keys. The moment was familiar, yet always new. She began with a gentle introduction, simple and calm, like a soft whisper. The notes flowed smoothly, filling the cafe with warmth. People paused in their conversations, cups frozen mid-air as the sound drew them in. She could sense their curiosity turning into attention, their casual interest transforming into genuine engagement. As she played, her fingers moved with increasing confidence. She added subtle variations, small flourishes that transformed the simple melody into something deeper. She could feel the story unfolding under her hands, the emotions rising and falling like waves. Each chord carried a different feeling, and she let herself be fully immersed in the music. Patrons who had once glanced at her with polite interest now watched intently. Their eyes followed every movement of her fingers, and their expressions reflected the impact of the music. Some looked amazed, their mouths slightly open in awe. Others leaned forward, almost as if trying to catch every note. She noticed a few who had come in late, stopping in the doorway. Their attention captured the moment they heard the piano. The music had become a magnet, drawing people in from every corner of the cafe. The man in the suit returned that day as well. He had been observing her quietly over the past few days, and now he seemed almost eager to see what she could do. He didn't speak or interrupt. He simply watched, a proud expression on his face. He could see the transformation in her, the way her confidence had grown, the way her music had begun to flow naturally and effortlessly. It was clear to him that she had something rare, something powerful, and he felt privileged to witness it. As the tune developed, she began to explore more complex harmonies. She added layers, intertwining melodies, and created gentle crescendos that rose and fell like a heartbeat. The music was no longer just a simple tune. It had become a living story. She could see the effect it had on the people around her. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the beauty they were experiencing. The room was no longer just a cafe. It had become a shared space for an intimate performance, and she was at the center of it. Time seemed to blur as she played. She lost herself in the music, unaware of the minutes passing by. Every note, every pause, every movement of her fingers was deliberate, yet effortless. She could feel the energy of the room, the collective attention of the audience, and it fueled her performance. The simple melody she had started with had grown into something much larger, something alive, and she reveled in it. The man in the suit finally spoke, softly, almost to himself. "She's incredible." The words were not meant to be heard by anyone else, but she caught them. For a moment, she paused, a smile tugging at her lips. It was encouraging, the kind of validation she had never sought but quietly hoped for. She took a deep breath and continued, letting the music carry her forward. As she reached the middle of her performance, she began to experiment more boldly. She introduced unexpected rhythms, delicate shifts in tempo, and gentle flourishes that made the melody sparkle. She could feel the audience responding. There were small gasps, quiet murmurs of surprise, and the subtle movements of people leaning closer to listen. Every note seemed to resonate not just in the room, but in the hearts of those who were listening. One elderly woman, a regular who had been coming to the cafe for years, placed her hands gently on the table and closed her eyes. She swayed slightly, letting the music move through her, and a faint smile crossed her face. She had never heard anyone play with such depth, such emotion. Even the baristas who had grown used to the background noise of the cafe found themselves watching in awe, pausing their work to listen. The young woman noticed the reactions, but she did not let them distract her. She was focused, fully absorbed in the music, feeling each note as it passed through her. She had learned over the years that true performance was not about showing off skill or seeking attention. It was about connection. It was about allowing the music to speak for her, to tell a story that words could not. And in this crowded cafe, she felt that connection stronger than ever. By the time she approached the final segment of her performance, the atmosphere had changed completely. The cafe was no longer just a place for coffee and pastries. It had become a shared experience, a space where people had gathered to witness something rare and beautiful. The man in the suit watched with a quiet pride, clearly impressed by the transformation he had witnessed in her confidence and skill. He knew that what he had seen was not just talent, but potential, the kind of potential that could change a life if nurtured properly. She played the last notes slowly, deliberately, letting them linger in the air. The final chord resonated, filling the room with a warm, gentle vibration. For a moment, there was complete silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The audience seemed to hold their breath, savoring the ending, reluctant to let the moment slip away. Then, as if waking from a shared dream, the cafe erupted into applause. It started quietly, with a few people clapping hesitantly, but it grew steadily, becoming a wave of sound that filled the room. People stood, some cheering softly, others clapping vigorously. Their admiration was genuine, unforced, and it filled her with a mixture of relief and joy. She had not only played for them, she had touched them in a way that went beyond the music itself. The man in the suit approached her once more. This time, his expression was a mix of awe and excitement. "You didn't just play," he said softly, almost reverently. "You made them feel something. That is rare. That is special." She smiled quietly, her hands still resting on the piano. I didn't know it would be like this," she admitted. "I've never played for so many people at once." He nodded. "And yet you did it beautifully. You didn't just perform, you connected. That is what matters. Never forget that." The applause began to fade, and the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Cups clinked, chairs scraped against the floor, and quiet conversations resumed. But something had shifted. People left that day with a sense of wonder, carrying the memory of her music with them. They had witnessed something they hadn't expected, something that lingered long after they had stepped out into the street. She sat quietly for a moment, after the cafe emptied, her hands resting on the keys. She could feel her heart still racing, a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion. It had been an intense experience, far beyond anything she had imagined when she first sat at the piano. And yet, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had faced her fear, shared her gift, and discovered a new part of herself. That night, she lay awake thinking about the day, replaying the performance in her mind. She remembered the expressions on the faces of the customers, the way their eyes had followed her hands, the quiet sighs and murmurs of admiration. It was overwhelming, but it also filled her with a sense of possibility. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what might come next, not just in the cafe, but beyond it. She began to see that her music could reach far more than just the few dozen people who had been present. It could touch strangers, inspire hope, and create moments of beauty in unexpected places. The thought was both exciting and frightening, but she felt ready to explore it. She had taken the first step, and now the world seemed full of potential. As the days passed, more people began to visit the cafe, curious to hear her play. Some came in groups, others alone, but all were drawn by the whispers of the music they had heard. And each time she played, she felt the same thrill, the same connection, growing stronger with every note. She began to understand that her talent was not something to hide or keep secret. It was something to share, something that could change not only her life, but the lives of others. Her confidence grew with each performance. She experimented with new melodies, played with emotions she had long kept hidden, and discovered the power of improvisation. She learned to listen to the room, to sense the mood of her audience, and to respond through her music. It was a skill that went beyond technical ability. It was a form of communication, a way to speak directly to. The cafe had changed in ways she could feel every time she entered. It was the same place, the same worn tables, the same scratched wooden floor, and yet it felt alive in a way it had never been before. People arrived not just to drink coffee or eat pastries, but to see her play. Some were curious, some were regulars returning after hearing about her music, and others were complete strangers drawn by whispers of her talent. The piano in the corner was no longer just a fixture. It had become the center of attention, a stage for something extraordinary. That afternoon, the cafe was crowded. The chatter of patrons filled the room, but there was an underlying current of anticipation. People glanced at the piano with curiosity and excitement, waiting for the moment she would sit down and play. She felt the familiar flutter of nerves in her chest as she approached, but it was accompanied by a quiet thrill. The music had always been a private world for her, but now it was connecting her to others in a way she had never imagined. She rested her hands lightly on the keys, closing her eyes for a moment to center herself. The cafe grew quieter as people sensed the beginning of something special. She started with a simple melody, soft and delicate, almost hesitant, but as her fingers moved, the music began to grow. Subtle changes in tempo, gentle variations in tone, and unexpected harmonies began to weave a story that held the audience's attention completely. It wasn't long before the effect on the crowd became visible. Conversation stopped, heads turned toward the piano, and eyes followed her every movement. The man in the suit sat quietly in the corner, watching her with a mix of admiration and pride. He had been present for her earlier performances and had seen her talent grow, but each time she seemed to surpass herself. He understood now that this was more than skill. It was passion, discipline, and a deep emotional connection to the music that radiated from her. The audience began to lean in. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others simply sat in silence, mesmerized. People who had come in for a casual afternoon coffee found themselves holding their breath, completely absorbed. It was as though the piano had opened a window into a world that existed just beyond the ordinary. A world full of beauty and emotion that few had ever experienced firsthand. Her fingers moved more confidently now, the music flowing naturally. She began to experiment with dynamics, softening and strengthening notes at just the right moments, creating tension and release that drew the listeners in. The melody became more complex, evolving into something far beyond the simple tune she had started with. She felt a deep connection to every note, as if the piano was not just an instrument, but a voice expressing feelings she could not put into words. The crowd was captivated. Some patrons whispered to one another, their voices hushed and filled with awe. "She's incredible," one said. "I've never heard anyone play like this before." Another shook their head, unable to believe what they were hearing. How does someone like her even exist? Even the regular staff were drawn into the music. The baristas paused mid-motion, cups in hand, watching with rapt attention. One of the older servers, who had worked there for years and rarely showed emotion, leaned against the counter, eyes fixed on her fingers, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It was as if everyone in the room had been transported to a different place, a world shaped entirely by the sound of the piano and the presence of the young woman playing it. As she continued, she allowed herself to explore more daring melodies. She introduced unexpected chord progressions and gentle dissonances that created moments of tension, only to resolve them with soft, flowing harmonies. Each variation felt natural, as if the music itself was guiding her. The audience responded instinctively. Some gasped softly at surprising notes, while others leaned closer to hear the delicate subtleties in her playing. It was not just a performance. It was a shared experience, a conversation between her and everyone listening. The man in the suit couldn't help but smile. He had never seen someone command a room like this, especially not with such quiet authority. She wasn't shouting for attention or performing for applause. She was playing from the heart, and that authenticity had a power that no one could resist. He could tell that this performance would be remembered long after the last note had faded. Midway through her playing, she noticed the subtle emotional shift in the audience. People who had been quietly observing were now visibly moved. Some had tears glistening in their eyes, while others held their hands to their chests, as if feeling the music deep within. She didn't understand it fully at first, but she realized that her emotions were being transferred through the piano to those who were listening. It was an invisible thread connecting her to everyone in the room, a shared heartbeat of feeling that transcended words. The cafe seemed to grow smaller around her. The chatter, the clinking of cups, the rustle of paper, they all faded into the background. There was only the music, the keys beneath her fingers, and the attentive faces of the people who had gathered to listen. She felt a strange combination of vulnerability and strength. Vulnerable because she was sharing something deeply personal. Strong because she could feel the impact of her music on others. She realized that this was what she had always been seeking, not just mastery of the instrument, but the ability to touch hearts and create moments of beauty. As the piece reached its climax, she allowed herself to play with abandon. Her fingers flew over the keys, weaving intricate patterns, yet every note was intentional. She created layers of sound that intertwined seamlessly, building emotion and intensity without ever losing control. The audience was spellbound. Some leaned forward in their seats, breathless. Others closed their eyes, letting themselves be carried away. Even the man in the suit, who had seen her perform before, was visibly moved. He could feel the emotion radiating from her, the depth of her talent, and the sincerity of her expression. When the final notes approached, she slowed her pace, allowing each sound to linger in the air. The crescendo had built to a point of complete emotional immersion, and now it gently receded, leaving the room suspended in silence. The final chord resonated, rich and full, vibrating through the floorboards and into the hearts of the listeners. The silence that followed was heavy with awe and unspoken admiration. No one moved immediately. No one spoke. They simply absorbed what had just happened, the echoes of the music lingering in their minds. Then, as if waking from a shared dream, the applause began. It started softly, hesitantly, from a few people who had been closest to the piano. Slowly, it grew, spreading through the cafe like wildfire. The clapping became rhythmic, people cheering softly, others whistling in appreciation. The atmosphere was electric, charged with excitement, admiration, and gratitude. She looked up from the piano, surprised and overwhelmed by the intensity of the reaction. The man in the suit approached her once more. His eyes were wide, his expression a mixture of pride and astonishment. "You did it again," he said quietly, almost reverently. "You didn't just play, you transformed the room. You made everyone here feel something they didn't expect. That is rare. That is powerful." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks. She had never thought of herself as powerful or extraordinary. Music had always been her private world, her refuge. Now she saw that it could be so much more. It could reach beyond her own emotions, beyond her own life, and touch others in ways she had never imagined. She felt a mixture of humility and pride, knowing that she had given something precious, something real. To the people who had listened, the applause continued, and people began to come forward, expressing their admiration. Some spoke softly, sharing how moved they had been. Others simply shook her hand or placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, unable to articulate the depth of their feelings. Each interaction reinforced the realization that her music had a unique ability to connect people, to inspire, and to create moments of pure emotion. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the cafe returned to its quieter rhythm. She remained at the piano for a moment, letting her hands rest on the keys, reflecting on what had just happened. She realized that this was not just a performance, it was a turning point. She had faced her fears, shared her talent, and witnessed the profound effect it could have on others. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her music could reach even farther, touching lives beyond the walls of the cafe. That evening, after the last customer had left, she sat alone by the piano. The room was still, and the soft glow of the lights created a gentle warmth around her. She began to play again, not for an audience this time, but for herself. Each note carried the memories of the day, the emotions she had felt, and the connection she had created. The music flowed freely, unrestrained, and for the first time, she truly understood the power of her gift. She thought about the people who had listened, about their reactions, their expressions, and their words. She thought about the man in the suit who had seen her potential before anyone else did. She thought about the small spark of courage that had led her to sit at the piano in the first place. And she realized that every step she had taken, every moment of practice and solitude, had led to this point. She had discovered not just her talent, but her purpose Dot, as she played into the night, she felt a quiet D. The days that followed her unforgettable performances were unlike anything she had ever known. The cafe, once quiet and ordinary, had transformed into a place where music and life intertwined. People came not just for coffee or pastries, but to hear her play. Word had spread beyond the regular customers. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers from other parts of the city had begun to arrive, drawn by the whispers of a young woman who could make the piano sing. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness each day. The attention was flattering, yet unfamiliar. Her life had always been quiet, private, and safe, and suddenly it was filled with curiosity, expectation, and admiration. She sometimes wondered if she was ready for this. Could she truly live up to the growing reputation? Could she maintain the authenticity and emotion that had captivated people in the first place? The thought was daunting, but whenever she sat at the piano and touched the keys, her fears seemed to vanish. The music was always bigger than herself, and it carried her forward. One afternoon, a small group entered the cafe that immediately set the room buzzing with quiet anticipation. They were not ordinary customers. Their presence radiated purpose and curiosity, as if they had come for a specific reason. She noticed the way they scanned the room and the piano with careful eyes. The man in the suit, who had become a familiar figure over the past weeks, gave her a reassuring nod. "They've heard about you," he said quietly. "Just play and let the music speak." She nodded, taking a deep breath. The cafe had already begun to quiet itself in anticipation, conversations dimming as the piano seemed to draw the focus of everyone present. She sat down, feeling the familiar weight of expectation settle on her shoulders. She began softly, gently easing into the first notes. The music floated across the room, capturing attention and curiosity, and she allowed herself to feel the calm that came when she touched the keys dot as the melody progressed. She began to add subtle embellishments, careful variations, and delicate harmonies. She had practiced improvisation for years in solitude, and now the moment demanded that she share that part of herself. The audience responded instinctively. Their movements slowed, conversation ceased entirely, and every eye turned to her hands on the keys. Even the most skeptical or hurried patrons seemed mesmerized. It was as though the music had created an invisible force, drawing them closer to her world, making them pause and feel. The group of visitors, who had arrived purposefully, exchanged glances among themselves. One of them, a woman with a kind face and attentive eyes, leaned in slightly, clearly impressed by the fluidity and emotion of her playing. Another, a man who carried himself with quiet authority, seemed to take careful notes in his mind, absorbing every detail of her technique and expression. She couldn't hear their thoughts, but she could sense the weight of their presence, the careful observation, and it made her even more determined to play authentically dot with every note. She felt more confident. The music grew in depth and complexity, flowing naturally from her heart to her fingers and into the room. She experimented with rhythms, layered melodies, and gentle crescendos that built emotion in waves. The audience was completely absorbed. Some had tears glistening in their eyes, moved by the unexpected beauty and passion of her playing. Others leaned forward, captivated by the subtle intricacies, by the skill and sensitivity that had been nurtured in private over so many years. The man in the suit observed from his usual spot, a quiet pride on his face. He had witnessed her growth from the first timid notes in the corner of the cafe to this moment, where her talent had matured into something extraordinary. He could sense that this group of visitors was significant, people who might see in her what he already had, a rare potential that deserved recognition dot as she played. She began to feel a growing energy from the audience. The music, which had once felt personal and intimate, now seemed to pulse through the room, connecting everyone who listened. She could sense a shared rhythm of emotion, a collective heartbeat that responded to her phrasing, her timing, and the subtle dynamics of the piece. It was not just a performance. It was a conversation, a connection, a shared experience that transcended words. The group of visitors quietly approached afterward, one by one, expressing admiration and curiosity. The woman with the kind eyes spoke first. "Your music. It's remarkable," she said softly. "There is a depth here that is rare. You have a gift, and it should not stay hidden." She shook her head gently, humbled by the words. I've only ever played here, for myself, for the few people who happened to listen," she admitted. "I didn't know anyone else would." Care. The man with quiet authority nodded thoughtfully. "Caring is exactly what we do," he said. "But there is more than caring here. There is talent, emotion, and a presence that few people possess. You have the potential to reach far beyond this cafe, if you want to." The words left her breathless. She had never considered stepping outside the small world she had created. Her music had been private, personal, and safe. The thought of performing elsewhere, in front of strangers or in larger venues, was both thrilling and terrifying. Could she maintain her authenticity in unfamiliar settings? Could she share herself fully without losing the intimacy that made her music so powerful? Before she could answer, the man in the suit stepped closer. "Take your time," he said gently. "You don't have to decide today. But opportunities like this rarely wait. When you're ready, people will listen. They will respect and value what you bring." Over the next few weeks, invitations began to arrive. People who had witnessed her performances sent messages, offering opportunities to play at small events, local gatherings, and even private functions. Some were formal, carefully worded letters expressing admiration and interest. Others were simple notes or conversations, full of genuine enthusiasm and hope. Each one filled her with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. She spent long hours reflecting on these invitations. She thought about her life so far, the quiet routines, the safety of her world, and the private joy of her music. And she thought about the possibility of stepping into a new realm, of allowing her talent to reach beyond the walls of the cafe. The idea was both intimidating and exhilarating. She realized that fear had always been a companion, but it could no longer hold her back if she wanted to grow. Finally, she decided to accept her first invitation. It was a small gathering, a private event with a limited audience, but it would be her first experience performing outside the cafe. She felt nervous, her stomach twisting with anticipation, but also a sense of determination. She had worked for years in solitude, honing her skill and developing her own voice. Now was the time to share it with others, to step into a wider world, and to see what could happen. The day of the event arrived, and she traveled to the venue with the man in the suit accompanying her. He offered guidance and reassurance, helping her navigate the unfamiliar surroundings and encouraging her to trust her instincts. When she arrived, she saw the audience waiting, expectant and curious. She could feel the weight of their attention, but she also felt the familiar comfort that came when she sat at the piano. The instrument, though different from the one in the cafe, felt welcoming, almost like an old friend Dot as she began to play. The initial notes were gentle and soft, just as she had done countless times before. But slowly, she allowed herself to explore the full range of expression she had cultivated over the years. Her fingers danced across the keys with confidence and grace, creating melodies that were rich, emotional, and intricate. The audience was silent, captivated by the depth of feeling in her music, by the skill and heart she poured into every note. She noticed faces in the crowd reacting with awe and wonder. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others leaned forward, entranced by the delicate interplay of melody and harmony. She felt a connection, not just with the audience, but with herself as if the music was affirming her choices and courage. The fear that had once held her back seemed to dissolve, replaced by the exhilarating certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be by the end of her performance. The room erupted into applause, louder and more sustained than anything she had experienced at the cafe. She felt a wave of emotion sweep through her, a combination of relief, pride, and awe. People approached her afterward, offering words of admiration, gratitude, and encouragement. Some spoke about the way the music had touched them personally, while others simply shook her hand, overwhelmed by the beauty of what they had heard. The experience transformed her. She realized that her music had the power to reach beyond herself, to move people, to create connections and moments of beauty that would be remembered long after the final note had faded. She understood that her talent was not just a gift for herself, but something to share with the world. And she knew, with quiet determination, that this was only the beginning of a journey that would take her further than she had ever imagined. From that day on, her life began to change. Invitations continued to arrive, each one presenting new opportunities and challenges. She traveled to small venues, performed for gatherings, and began to receive recognition beyond the walls of her cafe. Every performance strengthened her confidence, refined her skill, and deepened her understanding of the impact her music could have. By the time the final chapter of her journey in the cafe world arrived, she had changed in ways even she could hardly believe. The shy, quiet young woman who had once barely dared to play for anyone was now someone who drew crowds with the gentle gravity of her music. Her fingers moved over the keys with a fluid grace that came from years of private practice, years of trial and error, of learning to pour emotion into melody without fear. Yet she remained humble, never forgetting the small cafe where it had all begun. That morning, she arrived earlier than usual, the quiet hum of the city greeting her as she walked. The cafe was still empty, chairs stacked neatly, the scent of fresh bread and coffee lingering in the air. She approached the piano, her hands instinctively resting on the familiar keys. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she had achieved, the path she had taken, and the possibilities that lay ahead. It was a quiet, reflective moment before the storm of attention arrived, and she allowed herself to savor it. Soon the first patrons arrived, followed by others who had come from further away. Today, the crowd felt larger than ever. Friends of friends, neighbors, and even journalists were among them, curious to witness the pianist who had been quietly taking the world by surprise. She noticed their eyes on the piano, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. She could feel the energy in the room shift, as it always did before she played, the unspoken understanding that something special was about to happen. She began with a soft, simple tune, one that she had practiced countless times, yet always felt new in the moment. The sound floated across the cafe, capturing attention immediately. Conversations hushed, cups paused midair, and people turned toward the piano. The notes were gentle but deliberate, every touch of the key imbued with emotion. Even before she allowed herself to play freely, she could feel the room's collective breath, the quiet anticipation that had become a familiar companion over the past weeks. Then, gradually, she let the music expand. She layered melodies on top of each other, creating a richness and depth that seemed almost alive. Each chord resonated not just in the room, but in the hearts of those listening. People who had come to simply enjoy a cup of coffee found themselves entranced, unable to look away, caught in the spell of her music. Faces softened, eyes glistened, and quiet murmurs of appreciation rose from the audience. Carried on the current of the sound, the man who had first noticed her potential, the one who had watched quietly, encouraged her, and guided her in subtle ways, sat in his usual corner. He observed her now with a sense of quiet pride that had grown into something deeper. He could see the evolution of her talent, the transformation of her confidence, and the impact she had on everyone in the room. It was no longer just a performance. It was a shared experience, a communion of emotion between her and those who listened. As she moved into the middle section of her performance, she began to experiment more boldly. She added unexpected harmonies, subtle dissonances that created tension and suspense, then resolved them with soft, flowing chords. The music seemed to breathe, rising and falling like the tide, pulling the audience along with it. She noticed the reactions. Some eyes closed in quiet reverence. Others sparkled with wonder. A few faces reflected tears of awe. She realized then that her music had the power not just to entertain, but to touch, to stir, to awaken emotions that people didn't always allow themselves to feel. She thought back to the early days, the timid moments when she first played a few simple notes in the cafe corner, wondering if anyone would notice. She smiled softly at the memory. Those small beginnings had led her here, to a place where her talent was not hidden but celebrated, where her courage to share something deeply personal had become an inspiration for others. Every step of the journey, every private practice session, every nervous glance at the piano had mattered. The audience was fully absorbed now. Conversations had stopped completely, replaced by an intense focus that she could feel as a tangible force in the room. She played with a freedom she had never known before, improvising in ways that seemed to flow directly from her heart. The music became a language without words, a story told entirely through notes and rhythm. She realized that the audience was not just watching. They were listening, understanding, feeling. The connection was complete, and it filled her with a quiet, profound joy. By the time she reached the final segment, she allowed herself to play with full abandon. Her fingers moved swiftly and delicately, navigating intricate passages with precision and grace. The music built to a crescendo, filling every corner of the cafe, vibrating in the air and in the hearts of the listeners. The audience was spellbound, leaning in, holding their breath, utterly captivated. Some faces reflected tears, others quiet smiles, all united by the experience they were sharing. Then, as the final notes approached, she slowed her pace. Each note lingered in the air, soft yet deliberate, fading gently into silence. The room seemed suspended in time, caught in the echo of the last chord. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence itself was part of the performance, a shared reverence for what had just been created. Finally, the cafe erupted in applause. It started softly with a few hands clapping, then grew steadily, a wave of sound that filled the room. People stood, some cheering, some whistling in admiration. The energy was electric, charged with genuine appreciation. She looked up from the piano, her heart racing, and saw faces shining with awe and gratitude. It was a feeling she would never forget, the kind of validation that went beyond words, beyond recognition, beyond even her own expectations. The man who had first guided her through the early stages approached her quietly. His eyes were bright with emotion, and a small, proud smile tugged at his lips. "You've done it," he said softly. "You didn't just play, you touched them. You made them feel something real. That is the rarest gift of all." She felt tears welling in her eyes, but smiled, overwhelmed by the words and the experience. I just played," she whispered, unsure how to express the depth of what she felt. "No," he said firmly. "You shared yourself. That is what matters. That is what makes music powerful. You didn't just perform, you connected, you inspired, you gave people a piece of your heart." After the applause settled, people began to approach her. Some spoke of how moved they had been, sharing personal stories about moments in their lives that her music had touched. Others simply shook her hand, speechless, unable to articulate the emotion they felt. She listened quietly, absorbing each expression, each word, each gesture of appreciation. Every interaction reinforced the realization that her music had the power to move people, to create moments of beauty and emotion that could last far longer than the notes themselves. In the days that followed, her life continued to change. Invitations to perform kept arriving, each one an opportunity to share her talent with a wider audience. She traveled to small events, local gatherings, and eventually to larger venues where her music was met with admiration and respect. She faced challenges, the unfamiliar stages, the pressure of new audiences, the expectation to maintain her authenticity, but she met each one with the quiet strength she had developed over years of private practice and personal courage. She also learned to balance her life, keeping the music at the center while maintaining the humility and simplicity that had defined her for so long. She never lost sight of the cafe where it all began, often returning to play for the familiar faces who had witnessed her first timid steps at the piano. Those moments reminded her of the roots of her journey, grounding her as she navigated the expanding world of recognition and opportunity. Through it all, she remained human, vulnerable, and connected to the people who listened. Her music continued to speak in a language that transcended words, creating connections, inspiring hope, and touching hearts in ways she had never imagined. She realized that her talent was not just about skill or technique. It was about courage, authenticity, and the willingness to share something deeply personal. Years later, looking back on her journey, she understood how far she had come. From the quiet beginnings in a small cafe to performances in front of audiences who had come from far and wide, she had grown not just as a musician, but as a person. She had learned to embrace fear, to trust her instincts, and to allow her music to speak for her when words were not enough. Every moment, every note, every risk she had taken had shaped her path, leading to a life filled with beauty, connection, and meaning. Her story became an inspiration to many. People spoke of her journey as a testament to the power of perseverance, courage, and authenticity. They marveled at how a shy, private girl could transform her life and the lives of others through music. She had become a symbol of hope, showing that talent nurtured in quiet corners could bloom into something extraordinary when shared with the world. And as she continued to play, whether in a small cafe, a private gathering, or a larger stage, she carried with her the lessons of her journey. She remembered the first timid notes, the quiet encouragement of a mentor, the awestruck faces of the early audiences, and the power of connecting with others through music. She played with humility, passion, and a deep understanding of the responsibility and joy that came with sharing her gift. Every performance became more than just music. It